Good morning, everyone. May I invite those who are having coffee outside to come in as soon as possible? We would like to start. It's 9 o'clock. Thank you. And we have a lot of room inside, so just walk in. Thank you very much. We're having very good speed. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Wenran Jiang. I'm the advisor to IPD. I was told by our organizers just to forego the formality and let me open the second day session. I would say, and I guess you all probably agree with me, we had a wonderful day yesterday, okay? For a major policy-related conference on the Indo-Pacific region, this is very needed and is extremely good quality, and I learned a lot. So I was learning from other colleagues who are talking about this conference. So without being self-congratulations kind of thing, I just want to say thank you for both IPD and Canada West Foundation for an extremely good job. We had good panels, we had good discussions, we had good debates. And I see Minister, or I like to call him Minister Gary Mar, but Gary Mar was doing a fantastic job yesterday hosting the Masters. Hopefully this morning we extend yesterday's success and sessions and the dynamics. Okay, so this morning we open with the morning keynote, day 2. Extremely privileged to have been able to get Dr. Gregory Brown from the Australia Strategic Policy Institute, but he's based in Washington, D.C. office. And I learned actually he's an American, but with half family is Australian. So I don't know how to call you, but it's close enough, right? So it's my pleasure for the first time to have met with Greg. So I need to pull out his bio, which is a very long list of accomplished titles and works. So I want to make sure I accurately introduce him. Dr. Gregory Brown is Senior Analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and based in Washington, D.C. He's also the Adjunct Professor of George Washington University's Center for Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies. He is serving and has served in many positions. He has served as a consultant for Freedom House, the Frederick Albert Foundation in Berlin and Vienna, the Center for East European and International Studies in Berlin, and the UN Millennium Project's Global Challenges Program on Transnational Organized Crime, as a research fellow in the Australian Center for the University of Melbourne, and an Australian National University Parliamentary Fellow in the Office of the Shadow Minister for Immigration and Multiculturalism in Canberra. Dr. Brown's work in political demography, U.S.-Australian relations, comparative migration policy, and diaspora politics has been highlighted in The Economist, The Australian, the New Zealand Herald, and has been published in the National Interest, The Strategist, the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs, Political Science, and Australia's Journal of Demography, People and Place. At Georgetown, he regularly served as a moderator of the annual Marino Family Workshop for incoming freshmen and as a faculty reviewer for Fulbright, Marshall, and Truman Scholarship candidates. So he has also held other teaching positions, and he is now currently joining us to provide the second day keynote speech. And the format would be 15 minutes opening remarks, 10 to 15 minutes discussion with me, and 15 minutes, hopefully 20 minutes, where we discussed this yesterday. We would like to open up to the floor as soon as possible. So please join me to welcome Dr. Gregory Brown.
Well, thank you, Wenran, for that kind introduction. I forgot that I did a lot of those things. They seem a long time ago, but I'm really happy to be here this morning to talk to you. It is day 2. That means we've had a day to get used to each other, to relax, get to know each other, so we can now be open and honest. I hope to share a few remarks with you today that will be provocative and maybe get a few of you out of your seat to ask me some questions. I'm here in listening mode more than speaking mode, although I'm going to talk for 15 minutes. Because I wanted to hear more about Canada and what Canada needs to know about. I also, this morning, as Wenran said, want to thank Canada West and the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for inviting me to speak. I'm going to take what I've heard over the last 2 days back to Canberra, back to Washington, and let them know that it's time for Australia to stop thinking of Canada as America's hat. It's time for the thought leaders in the United States to remind their fellow citizens that the Canadian perspective and contribution is important and that they should listen. And when the organizers invited me to speak, they said that Canadians want to hear more about Australia and its experience navigating through the currents of great power competition. How does Australia view the Indo-Pacific? How does it view its place in the world? How does it secure its interests, knowing that those interests run counter not only to adversaries, of course, but sometimes run into trouble and controversies with friendly countries and with allies. What has Australia done right? Where, how, and why has it seen success? Where has it done wrong? And what controversies has it exposed back home? Where does it see challenges in the future? And then most importantly, as we've heard from yesterday and mention of Australia even this morning around the coffee, what is it that Canadians can learn from the Australian experience? And I think that means both successes and maybe some failures or some challenges or things to be wary of. When the organizers first came to me, they said, "Can you do this?" And I said, "Wait a second, guys, listen to my accent. I'm not an Australian. I don't have an Australian accent. I can't speak for the Australians." But they insisted that because of where I sit in my perch in Washington, D.C., as the lone American in an office full of Australians, talking to Canberra 4 nights a week, and that time zone thing is terrible. So that means my day starts at 8 a.m. and it ends about 11 p.m., just so you have to be on the Australian time. But from that perch, the hope was that maybe I see some things in D.C. and elsewhere, and what I hear from Canberra about its experience in the American environment, and then also what that might mean as Australia navigates the Chinese relationship. So with that in mind, I can't say much about the atmospherics in Beijing, but I can tell you what I do see. And to begin, I'll just say it's not an exaggeration to say that the shuttle diplomacy of Australians to Washington, D.C. has been on an absolute tear. In D.C., we have seen everybody, most people, multiple times. So this means junior staffers, mid-level staffers, senior officials, and principals coming to D.C. on a regular basis. And if not D.C., don't worry, come to the West Coast. Right, just recently, we had the Prime Minister visit Washington and then California, right, within a month, 2 visits to the United States, with a visit to Beijing in between. So he's collecting those frequent flyer miles. He's not the only one. It feels like we see the DPM, that's Mr. Marles, who also wears the hat of the defense minister. It feels like we see him in D.C. or California every other month. I know that's not quite what the calendar says, but that's absolutely what it feels like. And of course, the foreign minister has been to visit, and again, we see people all the time, and we expect that to continue. When I talk with people at the Australian Embassy in Washington, they say that half of their job, of course, is preparing for all those visits. They need more staff, and they can't keep up with the pace. They're doing their best. Again, we expect to see more of it. On top of that, I'm going to raise a hand. Maybe I'm going to ask you to be interactive here. Raise a hand. Has somebody been to D.C. since the new embassy opened? A few. All right, so you've seen this thing. So it's quite amazing. There's a brand new, gleaming Red Heart of Australia embassy right in the center of Washington, D.C. It's already full. And I got to tell you, it's not just the American border hawks who now start to talk about an Australian invasion of Washington. Right? So you do feel it. So you hear the accent when you walk the halls of the Pentagon. You hear the accent in every commercial consultancy in town when they talk about investment in the region. And you hear it every day. I hear it every day when people are asking for another flat white at all 3 coffee shops within 3 blocks of my office. It is regular and it is constant. What do they say? They say one thing. While Australia has all the usual interests of other states on global issues, its primary, secondary, and tertiary interests are really all about the Pacific. More and more Australian foreign policymakers increasingly see their country as the fulcrum around which the region will turn. It may not be there yet, but there is a big Australia idea and a big Australia policy for the entire region. In DC, you hear newfound fervor and interest in traditional defense, cyber threats, critical technologies, critical minerals, foreign interference, and hybrid warfare. This comes as Australia resets its security policy to focus on China and questions, sotto voce, of course, U.S. dependability. In the past decade, the reality of specific threats posed by Beijing and growing concerns about Washington's capacity and preference to maintain its presence in the Western Pacific have punctured the blissful optimism that previously prevailed. The latest Lowy poll, that's another think tank in Australia, my competitor, the latest poll that they have found that 3/4 of Australians now believe that China, their largest trading partner, will pose a military threat to Australia within the next 2 decades. This is a near 180-degree turn from where things were just a decade ago. So that shift in the Australian mindset has happened very rapidly. It's unsure how stable that attitude is. Could shift very rapidly again, but this is where it is. I think you might say that Australia has recovered from, in the words of historian Geoffrey Blaney, its, quote, freak phase, the calm almost unique in our history, end quote, and has really rediscovered its true anxious self. Both cultural imaginations and geopolitical realities have driven Australian concerns about distance from friendly nations, allied states, and protectors. The tone has changed since Japan was the face of the foreign menace, but as a trading nation wholly dependent on ships freely leaving and freely arriving, the need to find and bandwagon with a regional hegemon willing to defend movement on the high seas continues to occupy the Australian strategist's mind. Task 1 today for Australia: devise a way to settle up into a period of what Foreign Minister Penny Wong calls stabilized relations with China. This effort and the effectiveness of it will challenge and test the Australian-US alliance, how it transitions from a failed policy of engagement for engagement's sake and the more recent necessity of countering malign activity to a cohesive long-term strategy of engagement with due diligence for national and regional security. Task 2, to ensure that the U.S. maintains a clear-eyed focus on the Indo-Pacific and doesn't view China and the region as longer-term issues to which it can return at a later date. It's a huge chore. Frankly, I'm not sure Australia's going to be able to pull it off. We're in an era of angry right now. Russia has invaded Ukraine. There's no end in sight to that war. Tensions again are boiling over in the Middle East. Cybersecurity has gone mainstream, and the threat of climate change is finally being properly recognized as an international security issue in itself and as a force multiplier for other challenges. U.S. leadership will be needed to counter these multiple threats simultaneously over that same long period. As an ally that doesn't expect propping up, but does its fair share of heavy lifting, Australia is well placed to encourage Washington to focus that leadership on Indo-Pacific strategic competition. Australia's recent Defense Strategic Review and the AUKUS Optimal Pathway decision, Canberra believes, should fortify Australia's influence in the U.S. thinking and decision-making. And the objective of long-term stabilized relations with Beijing has a solid basis in the shared Australian and U.S. principle of cooperate where we can and counter where we must. For now, of course, that cooperation is mainly aspirational. There are just too few areas in which there's genuine trust to see real progress. But I think Australian commitment to do so, where possible, may strengthen its ability to counter Beijing's malicious behavior from a position of moral high ground which of course is so vital for the global narrative. That cooperation would also require foreign and defense policies to work hand in hand, but not be merged into a single strategy that either over-militarizes foreign policy or underplays the need for hard power to strengthen deterrence. As Deputy Prime Minister Marles has recently said, improving Australia's national security isn't provocation, it's prudence. And from where I sit, again in DC, it appears that Australia is trying to be realistic about a positive shared agenda. This includes a strategy that builds support from a nervous region about presenting positive initiatives that acknowledge and, when possible, address other countries' priorities. Southeast Asian and Pacific states that Australia feels it knows a lot about, but as everybody knows, could probably do a lot better, are they understandably worry about great power rivalry and rising tensions. But just like Australia, they are even more anxious about the prospect of American disengagement. Let me offer you just briefly 3 examples where Australia has had some success. Enter first AUKUS, something we've all heard about and of course started out as less than transparent, not only to the rest of the world, but even to the United States and to the UK and to the citizens of Australia. But it has 2 pillars. The pillars are submarines and then critical technologies that may influence and help the defense establishment in all 3 countries. As military tech and as a sharing pact rather than an alliance, it is a long way to go to deliver the goods. But the idea of AUKUS for the principals and for their countries means something much more than submarines. AUKUS is the language of integration and interchangeability rather than mere interoperability. Again, it's about integration, not just interoperability. It's about Australian taxpayers investing in U.S. shipyards to boost U.S. production for a distant guarantee that some of those products will one day belong to Australia. It's more and more often UK and US boats docking in Australia, ensuring that the United States and the UK automatically build that access into their force postures and their strategies. It's open talk and acceptance of an integrated defense industrial base. Australia will get more than it gives, but with Pillar 2, that's the critical technologies, Australia offers more than just rental property and has real contributions to make in fields such as AI and quantum. I'm actually very skeptical that the AUKUS-class submarine, that's phase 3 of the submarine plan, will ever manifest. But as I've just suggested to you, that maybe it's not the most important product of the pact. Issue number 2, cyber and advanced tech. There's really never been a better time for science and technology collaboration between the US and Australia. With the signing of the CHIPS Act in August of 2022, the US put its money where its mouth is by injecting funds to counter the rise of China, as both a technological competitor for the US and an adversary seeking to undermine infrastructure and technological standards globally for domestic gain. The US, of course, is keen to retain its leadership, but its critical dependency on semiconductors manufactured in North Asia was exposed during the COVID-19 pandemic. Supply chain delays caused major disruptions across most sectors of the economy, and it's a challenge that can't be met by the mighty American technology sector alone. Australia has sold itself in DC as a valuable ally for the US in a secure science and technology supply chain. It's a nation of thinkers and innovators who share the same democratic principles and has a long history as a trusted defense partner contributing unique capabilities and services through the Five Eyes Partnership. Enter issue number 3, climate and energy transition. The Albanese government has affirmed that climate security is becoming a pillar of the US-Australian alliance. Similarly, President Biden's national security strategy called for engaging key US allies in addressing climate change effects in the Indo-Pacific region. This alignment is also increasingly apparent in practice. A year ago, for example, Australia and the US co-hosted the 2022 Conference of the Chiefs of Defense from the Indo-Pacific, where the #1 issue on the agenda was the security implications of climate change. Energy transition, likewise in the Indo-Pacific, is pivotally important, and here China does have a role. It's the largest financier of renewable energy in the region. As one energy expert recently observed, China leads the world in wind and solar installation, in wind and solar manufacturing, in electric vehicle production, in batteries, in hydro, in nuclear, in ground heat pumps, in grid transmission and distribution, and in green hydrogen. It literally leads the world in every zero emissions technology today. That gives Australia an incentive to engage with China to accelerate its own regional energy transitions. The challenge, of course, that Australia deals with is finding ways to do so without jeopardizing or undermining its core strategic and security interests. Before we get started in the Q&A, based on these three examples and what I see in DC, I'll offer some lessons perhaps that Canada can adopt, perhaps not. First, as we all know, diplomacy is the art of getting your interests on someone else's agenda, and Australia is relishing its current opportunity to help guide U.S. policymakers. They aren't shy about it. So lesson number one, which Australia has learned, did not come naturally to them, and I don't think probably comes naturally to most Canadians, is be bold. Be bold with the Americans and be bold with the Chinese. The AUKUS agreement, right, started as an Australian idea, went to the UK, went to the US and said, please, United States, give us your crown jewels. Give us the nuclear propulsion technology, something the United States had not shared with another country since the late 1950s when it shared it with the UK. Not something you're likely to give up. Australians got their way. They asked. If you don't ask, you can't be denied. Give the United States a chance to turn you down. Being bold mattered. That was a shift from old Australian policy of deferring to the United States and waiting to be told what to do next. Secondly, in the current government in Australia, we do see some bold actors who I think are having a real effect. Penny Wong in particular, as the foreign minister, is not shy about asking for the United States to be engaged economically in the Indo-Pacific in a way different from what we hear American officials talk about. And we're looking for more inclusion, right? More liberalism, so getting away from some of the industrial policy of the United States seems to be headed towards, and again, more direct investment in the region specifically. That, again, is a change. When she gave a speech at the Carnegie Foundation following the 2022 Australia-US 2x2 meeting, she got everybody up on Twitter in the United States because she was so bold, and people were not used to hearing an Australian talk directly to the United States in such a way. You can do this when you're friends, right? When you're allies, yes, but that's different from being friends. You can tell your friends what they need to hear. Australia has woken up to that idea that you can get by with a little help for your friends, but sometimes your real friends are the ones you can trust to tell you the truth. Australia became a real friend by telling its truth and by explaining to the United States that they need to remain committed to the Indo-Pacific and to be there now. The second lesson, which is really something that's come on in Australian policy as it really looks at these two strategies of dealing with great power competition on one side and then also handling the region in a slightly different manner, is to take a whole-of-nation approach. And this is a phrase you hear now again and again coming out of a number of Australian documents. Whole-of-nation. That's not whole-of-government, it's something much bigger. And this is where I think somewhere like Canada actually probably could take a similar approach. Because Canada, like Australia and the United States, are federations of states or provinces in which power is shared constitutionally, but where foreign policy has traditionally been in the province of the national government alone. But we all know that that's not how the world works. Premiers, governors, mayors of large cities, local officials in counties, and other leaders take an active role in their own foreign policies, and coordinating those policies with the national government, but not necessarily on the direction of the national government, is vitally important. Australia is now aware of this as its own premiers from various states have visited China and elsewhere and engaged directly with world leaders. Same thing has happened in the United States. We see in the U.S. State Department the creation of a new ambassador for subnational diplomacy in the United States to make sure to take advantage of these benefits. Canada has the same opportunities, and I think probably could take advantage of that. It's vitally important, I think, that we do that in this globalized digital world where the constitutions may say one thing, but reality is somewhat different. The subnational governments play vital roles in helping maximize national capacity, as well as building trust in the institutions that we all hold so dear. It's subnational governments and subnational relationships that build people-to-people, cultural and economic links that create deep connective tissues that maintain relationships, including those vital to the U.S.-Australia alliance and Canada's role in the world, no matter the politics of the day. So no matter what happens in the capital, those personal relationships and those deeper relationships remain. The third thing I'll share is this idea of a step up and really going the extra mile. And I know this isn't an actual mechanism, or it's not a policy per se, it's just a different approach that the Australians now seem to be taking. I already made reference to the Australians' many visits to Washington, D.C. The Americans have not reciprocated in kind. They are not making multiple trips, right? That long 24-hour flight that goes all the way down, it's not happening. Australians are too distracted, too busy. The importance of something like the 2x2 ministerial meetings for Australia are vitally important. They're a big deal every single year. For the US players, they're a Tuesday. They do this all the time. It's not the same thing. Australia now, I think, does not expect that kind of reciprocity. They know that if they want to get the attention of the Americans, they have to be the ones to show up. Now, I know, and I was talking with Kai this morning, that this is also maybe a little difficult for Canadians because, as Kai said, you know, as Canadians, sometimes it's nice to be ignored by the United States, right? To be a little bit under the radar because the Americans are always here in your face, and they can't help it. They're right there, and they're big. Australians, though, have the opposite problem. Their concern is the fear of abandonment, that the United States will not be there, that they will not show up. So they must be the ones to make a step forward. I don't know, as Canadians, what you can make with that. Does that mean you do what the Australians have done, rather than wait for the Americans to come to you? But maybe it's something to have discussion about. The other part of stepping up and going the extra mile is that Australia has committed, officially, to spending a minimum of 2% of its GDP on defense each year. It's not quite there. It's just under that 2% threshold. But with the known expense to come from AUKUS, it seems unlikely that the U.S. will ask Australia to commit to a higher percentage, and rather will simply ask for a commitment to capability development and strategic alignment. So there are trade-offs to be made, and I think Australia has played this right. This relates to another question which I've been asked, I think, 5 times since I arrived on Sunday night. A number of people, some of you in this room, have asked me how Canada can prepare for a potential Republican administration in 2024. My bottom line advice, focus on delivering results that align with America's concrete interests, above all by shouldering more of the strategic burden. Democrats and Republicans both, I think, will increasingly look at what allies are doing on defense spending. Relying on the optics, the appearance of comedy, and the rhetoric about a rules-based international order will not be enough. I think you'll see more pressure on countries that are, the U.S. believes anyway, are not pulling their weight. Taiwan, Germany, Canada. And you'll see more support for countries taking their defense seriously and willing to do something about it. India, Poland, Australia. Thank you.
These are automatic, so just very good. That was very, Greg, it was very insightful. Thank you for sharing with us from Australia, from the United States. And that angle is, I mean, it resonates with us. I mean, Canada wanted to be the close allies with, you know, like Australia. So as we discussed, I don't really have a preset of questions. I wanted to listen to you. Now we heard you. My questions will be very much to complement your speech by maybe covering maybe a few other areas. You've emphasized quite a bit of about the dynamics between Australia and the United States, and that's where you are doing your job, as well as how that means for the whole Indo-Pacific region. So my first set of questions is really with the Canadian context in the background. How Australia manages the Indo-Pacific region, specifically India and China. You know what's going on with Canada's situation. We have a long years of strained relationship with China, and recently with India. But we look at Australia, you seem to be, at least at the current government, is doing something quite right. Is that a good assessment? Or tell us the so-called dynamics, how you manage those great power relations in the region.
Yeah, let me start with both, but perhaps start with China, since that, for Australia and for all of us, is the elephant in the room, panda in the room, whatever the Australians want to say. It had, like as I mentioned in my remarks, it hasn't always been so. Those of you who are Australian watchers will again know that even 10 to 15 years ago, the Australian public, Australian governments at the time felt very differently about China. China was looked upon as being the cash cow that would always keep giving. As the largest recipient of exports of natural resources from Australia, particularly all those minerals from Western Australia, all the iron ore, we're looking at high numbers of nearly 40% of Australian mineral exports went directly to China. As the Australians became aware of some nefarious activity inside Australia in particular, entering some political interference, so that should resonate as well as some coercive diplomacy in the region more generally, Australians started to sour on the relationship. But of course, they haven't soured on the relationship economically. China responded to Australians calling them out on some of the behaviors by really imposing the tariffs and the trade restrictions that damaged Australia or looked to be damaged Australia, including then offering a list of about 14 different things that Australia could do if they wanted to get the relationship back on track. I'll just say that I think item number 10 or 11 on that list was actually stop funding the think tank that I work for. So I have feelings.
14 grievances.
We're only one of 14.
They haven't got the list on Canada, by the way, but go ahead.
That's right, not yet. All right, that's fine. So Australia has had some repairs to do. Now, to be honest, some of those resources then ended up going to primarily South Korea and Japan, which sort of helped Australia buffer through this time. But that need is still there. I'll tell you what I hear from Australians in Canberra, government officials, is that they have a difficult time with their own populace explaining this and why they must continue such a hard line. Because anytime that they mention something that might be thought of as sort of being anti-China or anti-trade with China, and by something strange or that would be challenging, I mean something as simple as that that Australia is trying to defend a free and open, or to provide the navigations that we need to be able to trade, that we need to defend that, or mention things, as I said, like the rules-based order discussion. Anytime that happens, within 15 minutes, folks in Canberra know they're going to get phone calls from the CEOs of the largest mining companies in Australia saying, what are you doing? Why are you saying this? And why are you putting me on a back foot? So the tension is real in Australia. There is this play between civil society and the commercial industry and where the Australian government is. The current government, I think you're right, they're doing something different. Whether it's better or not, that has probably yet to be seen. But is certainly something different. Much of that was just been a change in tone. So the previous government in Australia had a difficult time, was very, very direct and very bold, and in the domestic context, probably damaged itself politically by doing so, by dividing some of the public. So the current government coming in had a very different approach, wanting to absolutely double down on the U.S. relationship. I'll just mention that, immediately after coming into office and before it, after a 2-hour discussion alone, the new government, moving from center right to center left, accepted AUKUS wholeheartedly, even though they came in blind to the meeting. So that relationship has been solidified. That's definitely the press of where Australia is. But also this need to repair the relationship with China, primarily because Australians still know that is still the largest trade partner. That is still the future. China is going nowhere. You must deal with it. If you think about India relationship, I'll just briefly talk about that one. Australia is also in an interesting place, but maybe, of course, not where Canada is. The real issue there is the need to share the strategy and the cooperation and the future coordination in the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific, and recognize that India is an up-and-comer. It's also true that Australia looks at India as being a key player in the Pacific itself, perhaps filling some of those roles economically that China used to fill for various other regional partners. And so Australia is very keen to develop that relationship, but is well aware that there are times when the Indians and the Australians do not necessarily share the same kinds of tight values that we might find with other partners, even within the Quad.
Oh, that's very good. Because of timing, I won't pursue more because there's a lot into it, right? So especially, I originally was thinking about how this internal Australian debate about grand strategy is going on. You mentioned Scott Morrison, and there's Paul Keating. I just wanted, if we have time, maybe we can do that. But let me move on to the second question that I have. You mentioned trade already. What is the dynamic that both Canada and Australia, in fact, having strained political relations with China, and yet in recent years, both countries has more than double-digit trade increase with China. So it looks like there's a double track situation. So talk about the strategic hedging, AUKUS, Quad. How do you manage the dynamic on the one hand, strategically do what you talked about, while at the same time and keeping the economic side of the things going? You mentioned China put on some tariffs. I noticed Australia now probably is the largest LNG exporter, around 80 million tons per year, more or less Qatar and the United States around that mark. You don't have any limitations to use it as a strategic goods to go to China, for example, which takes the largest share, 30% of Australian LNG. So in general, the minerals, iron ore, which they buy so much. What is the dynamic? How you manage that?
So this is where I say it's going to depend, and we have to wait and see whether the strategy is going to play out and whether it's going to be a success for Australia or not. And it does get back to the earlier question, which we haven't talked about, and what does this mean domestically and what it happens inside Australia with this debate. As I mentioned, there are key factors and key drivers in the Australian economy that want the Chinese relationship to continue as it once did. On the other side is that foreign policy establishment that is much more hawkish on China that honestly doesn't take into account the economic effects of some of their choices and some of their preferences. In this sense, Australia is probably heading towards some sort of large change or crash where one side will win that argument. I think at the moment, the relationship with the United States is so tight and so interwoven and becoming more so that it's likely to move in that direction. That means that Australia will probably take it again in the wallet with regard to trade with China and then look for other sources, other locations where they can deliver those natural resources. That's going to be important for something like the United States because the U.S. really doesn't have this understanding of what it means to Australia to do that. Of course, the United States has, across all sectors and domains, probably much more trade with China than Australia does, but not in things like minerals and natural resources, where for the United States, I think the number, the percentage was probably maybe 7 or 8%. But again, nearly 40% from Australia. Yeah. So if you think about something like LNG, and transitions to energy, Australia sees it has to be the forefront of this. As I mentioned in my remarks, China is at the forefront of all of these things. I don't see Australia really moving away from that. They're going to try the two tracks, but whether they can pull that off is an open question.
A quick follow-up on LNG, since you mentioned it. Australian LNG basically exclusively export to China, Japan, South Korea, very little to Southeast Asia. Does it have a dynamic when you mentioned energy transition and climate management, do you have internal discussion saying Australia, together maybe US, Qatar, in the future Canada, to go massively exporting more LNG to China, or Japan and South Korea less so, to replace coal, and to lead to net global emission reductions? Do you have that discussion going on, or there's the other side of the question is are you in a competition situation with the United States? Because Canada is going to have next year, the year after, 14 million tons per annum LNG Canada phase 1, others are in application. Is Canada potentially a partner or competition in this regard, together with the United States? Just on that, yeah.
Well, Wenran, I'm not in those discussions, so I don't know exactly what happens. I imagine, though, that Australia does play this on both sides. It recognizes the U.S., I think probably even more than Qatar, is the largest competitor for that LNG and where it will go, and maybe has that yet to play in this game. But I'm not in those discussions, so I don't want to suggest that I do.
You're like an ambassador yesterday. They're all tight lips. But anyway, floor is open. I have tons of questions, but I think I would like the audience to get involved. Jump in with the short comments if you want, but we don't want to have a lecture. But best to have a question for Greg to take advantage of his expertise here. All right, thank you, Veena, for starting it.
Yes.
Go ahead, yeah.
Thank you very much, Veena Najibola. Thank you, Greg. Just following up on discussions on China, You mentioned that Australia has been successful in stabilizing relations, having a more cohesive engagement strategy. One thing that is a factor in Canada is our domestic politics and public opinion. In Australia, you have the same situation, very negative views on China. Apart from the change in government, what were other contributing factors to having public support for the kind of change in tone and posture that has happened in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, in Australia, domestically, you saw the change in government, and like happens in many places, people get tired with the current government. They want to change, and they get tired of the personalities, too. That certainly happened in Australia. I think the other part of it here is actually, as I sort of alluded to, is perhaps the softness that of Australian opinion. Right? I mentioned that the switch from positive to negative on China happened very, very rapidly. And it was due to, I think, really a number of revelations, again, about China's involvement in the greater region, but actually in Australia. So it turned Australians off. It was based on media reports. Certainly an activist think tank and academic QD changed that opinion, and then a handful of politicians.
And how did the change back happen?
Well, that's it. So all of those revelations, if they peter out or they're not as many, not as regular, right, that opinion, that public opinion gets very, very soft, and the idea of moving back towards it could again become important. It's also true that Australia had an economic downturn, not something that they're used to, and there's a generation about my age and maybe a little older that had never had an economic downturn, had never had that kind of economy. That has happened now. Younger Australians in particular are very concerned about the domestic economy. They can't afford to buy homes. Prices are going up. They see the inflation rate. All these things matter to them. The economic issues and the trade abroad, they know they're dependent upon it. China still seems to be the most open or willing partner to want to deal with Australia. Remember that idea of that 40% or nearly 40% of minerals going to China really has Australia over the barrel, but just reverse it. China desperately needs that from Australia as well, right? At the moment that they're in conflict or at their intention of discussions, they're at the cusp of a diplomatic breakthrough to make it all happy again.
And quick follow-up, if I may, on economic coercion. You mentioned one of the things that Australia is now doing is using the relationship as friends, not just allies with the U.S., to push the U.S. on certain agendas. Could you share a little bit of thinking in your own think tank or in Australian debate around issues of economic coercion from China? We obviously saw that during the time that you had some trade sanctions, California wine was doing really well in China. There was not a lot of, there might have been solidarity, but ultimately there was not a lot of economic solidarity, I guess, from the U.S. What are the nature of the conversation around economic coercion and how you'll be able to manage both tracks, the trade and the national security track with China? Thanks.
Yeah, I think this is part of the policy of the Australians of coming to Washington, D.C. often and have those deep discussions, certainly at the principal level, but also a little bit farther down in the hierarchy. And that is to make sure that these issues, where there might be some natural competition between the allies, are worked out before the Australians go back to China. And again, this idea of the tariffs, all right, so agriculture, wine, lobsters are not going to China, therefore somebody else can pick up the slack. Coordinating that and finding some sort of trade-off with those partners has been vital. Again, I think this is where the Australians recognize it, and it's why they have this policy of we need to get things on the table with the Americans every single time, and we can't rely on the Americans to bring it to us. So again, my suggestion for Canada is do the same.
All right. We got 3 people there. I would like to have the questions in time limit. So get all of 3 of you, maybe. Is that okay, Greg? We have all 3 questions, and you respond accordingly. Yes, I will.
Hi, I'm Hasit, researcher from New Zealand and Sri Lanka. My question is to Dr. Brown, is focusing on when Australia entered the security infrastructure with the US, it feared its neighboring states, especially New Zealand. I remember the PM Jacinda making a statement about the nuclearization of Pacific. Right. So what would be, in your opinion, what would be the best strategy to mitigate this double trap? In one case, wind neighboring state like Pacific Island state, Samoa, Tonga, and Papua New Guinea, and New Zealand, and other state maintaining the political or foreign policy equilibrium between the US and China. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Next one. Sean.
Yeah. Don't worry, I'll be brief. I was going to have some obnoxious comments about European settler states, but I'll save that for later. I have two quick questions. Given the background, given what China has done to alienate Australia, is there anything that China can do in its diplomacy that would actually reverse that? Or has that ship sailed and it's just lost that plot completely? Secondly, my observation is that the United States has lost pretty much every war that it's fought since the end of World War II. And that's largely because the Americans don't know what they're doing. They don't understand the people they're going to war with. And that may well be happening with China as well. So when you're encouraging us to put more money into our military and develop, a more militarized approach to the world, is it possible that we may end up following the United States down another destructive rabbit hole that, frankly, we shouldn't be involved in? Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Ambassador Peggy Mason.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll be very, very brief. It's just a comment. In light of our guest's statement that Canada should be spending more on defense, I think it's interesting that throughout this conference, there's been no mention of the fact that after a defense review in 2017, Canada increased its defense budget by 70% over 10 years. By 2027, our annual defense budget will have more than doubled. And the procurement system is under such pressure that that Canada, D&D, has lapsed. It has gone back into its budget of about $2 billion a year because they cannot spend the money. So I just think we have to, and following on the comment about, the gargantuan amount of the American defense budget, I really think that we ought to, keep in perspective and look at the true state of Canadian defense spending. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. Here you go, Greg. Looks like the microphone from the left is having the questions. So please.
That makes sense. Yeah. The first question regarding Australia's ability to navigate again between its own two strategies, and particularly with the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and how it varies from dealing with the two great powers that it faces. Australia has taken a position that with the region, it wants to meet states where they are. Now, that's not sure exactly what that means, right? But where they are suggests that it will hold back somewhat on some of the preaching and the Western liberalism, that maybe some of the human rights talk except at the margins, and be a little bit more direct, accepting that certainly the Pacific Island states and the Southeast states do not want to have to make a choice between the two great powers, do not want to have to choose a side. And Australia is quite directly then saying, you don't have to, but we still like you to prefer us. But we're not going to coerce you to do that. The other language that's come out of DFAT, and particularly from the foreign minister, is this idea of strategic equilibrium. Now, when I first heard that, I thought, oh, wow, is there a game theorist sitting on the staff now over at DFAT? And no, there's no game theorist in there talking about strategic equilibrium. This is basically just a change of language, somewhat like we heard about a change of language yesterday. In tone, I think, for the region, saying strategic equilibrium is meeting you where you are. You do not force to choose between one side or the other. And we're looking for all states to maintain their sovereignty and their ability to decide for themselves. And regardless of how large you are, how powerful you are, how rich you are, you have those same rights. So it is about rules, it is about laws, and it's that understanding that they're all at the same table sitting together. This idea of respect even for, in the Pacific, very small countries, in some cases microstates, right? That they also have the same say. In reality, I don't know that works, because power matters, and strong states still do what they can, and the weak still do what they must, and that's been true since Greece. And so with that, Australia is playing that double role. They have a voice there. They are in the region more than anyone else. So if you look at the Pacific Island states and the independent states there, Australia has a consulate or an embassy in every single one of them. The United States not even close. Australia has consciously gone out and speaks to them. There is concern and understanding that the region does not like the militarization, is concerned that things like AUKUS does mean more militarization. Honestly, it probably does. So they've increased their messaging to try to explain their position to the region. It doesn't necessarily mean that the region will accept that, other than saying, we get it, that's Australia's interest. We might disagree. At least the Australians are talking to us like they didn't used to speak with us. So they're showing up, and the discussion is much more full. On the other side of that, what Australia has done is saying, we also now are going to take much more concerted interest in the human security concerns within the region, not just the military, and thinking that if they put more attention on those issues, that the region will then be more amenable to Australia's harder traditional security concerns itself. That is a bet. It's a bet that has yet to pay off. We'll see where it goes. On the other questions about entrapment, perhaps, right? Going with the United States means that whatever the U.S. does decide to do, you might be in deep. In the Australian debate over AUKUS, this is forefront. Right? This is the argument. Is that by going whole hog with the Americans, if the Americans decide to do something, let's say with Taiwan, the Australians want to be there, you will get pulled in. Frankly, it is that trade-off. It's that trade-off to get rid of the anxiety that the Australians will not be here should we need it. We may have to accept that the Australians will expect us to show up even when we don't. Australia has been in a position, of course, where it has been in every major war, whether they won it or lost it, since World War II, not the little ones, but all the big ones. And so in some sense, Australia has lost those battles as well. The anxiety that Australians traditionally feel, and I think feel again, I think overrides this concern of entrapment. But that is where the domestic debate certainly is. So we mentioned Paul Keating's or certain members of Australian intelligentsia, which are very concerned about American adventurism and then being pulled along into something. So that will be something which we'll have to watch. The last question briefly was?
About arms increase.
Oh, arms, great. So this is a choice for Canada to make. I mean, the Australians certainly look at this like, okay, strategic equilibrium. Every state will make its own choices. Some states will choose to go one way, some states to go another. In the Pacific right now, we have a handful of states that are looking at getting militaries for the first time. They don't have them. I don't know why they need them, but if they wanted it, they want them, they're allowed to get them. Australians will certainly recognize that this is a Canadian choice. All I was sort of suggesting was that in the United States, the tone that I hear is the Americans are much more concerned that they want to see everybody step up a little bit. Canada may get more of a pass from the Americans because of the shared border, the shared space in North America, that someplace like Germany perhaps, or even Taiwan, as Americans look for it to step up for its own defense, may not receive.
This is great, Greg. You and I actually talked about saying 45 minutes, that will pass very quickly. It has passed very quickly. We're a little bit over time, right? So please join me, thank Dr. Gregory Graham. Immediately? Yes, please, just stand by. Thank you. Yeah.